Nature is one of, if not the most covered topic when it comes to art. The mystery and majesty of the natural world has fascinated people for thousands of years. Artists are always trying to capture the magnificence of nature in so many different ways. In this video, I want to talk about one piece of art that I believe has not only captured the quiet splendor of nature, but also shows how many different art forms can come together to create something truly beautiful. Today, I'm going to talk about The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. And yes, I'm calling video game art. In the same way a beautiful drawing can be considered art, so can a video game. Because at the end of the day, art is an expression and is meant to make you feel something. But first, let's talk about The Legend of Zelda and what it is. But in order for me to do that, we need to go back to 1986 when the first game released on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Obviously, time has changed a lot since then and now. The original Legend of Zelda essentially created the adventure genre. Over the years, the series became very famous for its quality and creativity. Games such as Ocarina of Time revolutionized what video games could be and were universally praised for their charm, lovable characters, interesting story, and memorable music. But over the years, future titles had become predictable and seemed to follow a simple formula for success. The games were still excellent and were always rated highly by fans and critics, but innovation seemed to be less and less important to the development team as time went on. That was until 2017. Breath of the Wild was the Zelda game people had been anticipating for 4 years, since the game's initial announcement in 2013. The development team had said they were taking a very different approach to the Zelda series, and for the first time ever, they wanted to make a Zelda game where you could go anywhere and do anything. The game released in March 2017 and was met with universal praise from both critics and fans. People were blown away with the game, and by many, it is considered the greatest game of all time. The game won over 50,000 awards and is widely considered the pinnacle of open world design. But why? What did this game do that was so revolutionary? Hidemaru Fujibayashi, the director of Breath of the Wild, said in an interview that instead of simply following tradition and putting things in the game because that's what they've always done, the Zelda team decided to look at everything that they've ever done and essentially ask the question, what makes a Zelda game?
当初から変えていこうと、ゼルダの当たり前を変えていこうという形で考えてゲームの開発を始めていました。具体的にはそのゼルダで変えない普遍的な部分っていうものと当たり前と言われている部分で変えていくっていうところで線引きをしながらいろいろと仕様を考えていくっていう作業だったんですが、最初から一応決まってはいましたが、その全てが決まっていたわけではなくて、指針を決めて大枠のコンセプトっていうところで変えていこう、そして変えないところはどこであろうかっていうことをスタッフと一緒に考えていったというような流れです。
今作ではそのゼルダの当たり前を見直すっていう、我々制作者にとってもそれをキャッチフレーズにして進めていたんですけども。
The team got together and decided that they needed to look back and rethink how their games could be made. So they stripped down the series to the bare essentials. They wanted to create a large open world, so they knew if they wanted players to believe they were transported to another world, they would need to focus on the world more than anything.
開発の当初からゼルダの当たり前を見直すというものがテーマにありましたので、広い世界で冒険しようと並行して、原点回帰というテーマもありまして、でじゃあ原点回帰って何だろうかって思った時にファミコン時代の、最初のゼルダを、思い浮かべると。
The team studied nature and took great care to create a world that was believable, interesting, and yet uniquely fantastical. The systems they were designing the game for were not quite powerful enough to do modern level of computer visuals, but the studios and teams at Nintendo were used to this. Nintendo consoles were rarely the most powerful of their generation, and instead opted to use a cel-shaded art style to make the game more visually distinct and pleasing to the eye, despite the limitations of the hardware. The team focused on using soft palette colors for nature, and used specific colors like blue and purple, and associated them with specific feelings, ideas, and characters. The main antagonist of the game, the Demon King Ganon, is associated with the color purple. Almost every instance where there is purple, Ganon's presence is there. For example, when machines like the Guardians and Divine Beasts are possessed by Ganon, they are always purple. When monsters die, they turn into purple smoke, and when fragments of Ganon, aka the Blights, die, purple blood pours from their body. The designers intentionally made almost every instance of purple to have a connection to Ganon, and since Ganon represents pure evil, that sinister feeling is then associated with purple, meaning that the player begins to associate purple with evil. Blue is similar in how it is used to convey thoughts and ideas. Blue is a symbol of purity and goodness. For example, the main protagonists, Link and Zelda, primarily wear blue. The Sheikah technology, when used for the player's advantage, turn blue. Even the Master Sword, the weapon that is meant to counter Ganon, shines blue when it's at peak power. But those are just some of the visual elements that the development team used to express ideas. What about the audio of the game? Well, Zelda games of the past were very famous for capturing the grandiose spectacle of adventure with bombastic orchestral compositions and memorable tunes. So what did the team decide to do when it came to the music and audio design for Breath of the Wild? Well, watch this clip. It's quiet, isn't it? The difference between how exploration is treated is completely different than games of the past. Instead of memorable and bombastic orchestral music, there's only a single lonely piano playing a slow, almost broken melody, spaced out by periods of silence, where nothing but the sounds of nature and the environment can be heard. But why? Why did the designers suddenly change the style of music for traveling the world? Well, for one, the land is huge, and exploring a world where the same music plays over and over for hours would become annoying. There's also the significance of the story. The world of Breath of the Wild is broken after an apocalyptic event destroyed most of the land, causing nature to take over most of the man-made structures. Link, the main protagonist the player controls, is alone, traveling the land in solitude to complete his quest. Then there's how the piano is used to accompany the environment and not drown it out. Depending on the weather conditions, the piano can become clearer or more muffled based on the environment. If it's raining, the piano will be muffled as if the player is hearing it through the rain. This departure from the style of music from the past has led some disgruntled fans to claim that the game's soundtrack is non-existent. However, this could not be further from the truth. With about 6 hours of atmospheric music tracks, Breath of the Wild soundtrack does many interesting things. For one, it's fully orchestrated with live instruments, so the composers were able to pick very specific sounds for different feelings, characters, and races, which are represented by the music in the towns and villages that the people call their homes. For example, the Gorons, which are essentially rock or mountain people, contain various percussion and brass instruments in tracks like Goron City. The Zora, which are simply put fish people, have very aquatic sounding instruments like harps and steel drums, and a piano that ascends and descends throughout the background of the piece Zoro's Domain. The Gerudo, or desert people, are represented by typical East African instruments that are commonly associated with the desert, like the instruments that are heard in the song Gerudo Town. Then there's the Rito, which are bird people, whose main instruments consist of guitars, accordions, woodwinds, and strings. Lastly, there's the Sheikah tribe, who are heavily inspired by traditional Japanese culture. So therefore, the instruments associated with the Sheikah tribe are very traditional Asian instruments. So why do this? Well, I believe that the designers wanted players to almost subconsciously create a symphony of different instruments in their mind without them even thinking about it, because all the music in Breath of the Wild is so intricately composed that every track tells a story. How so, you may ask? Well, in some tracks, depending on what the player does or where they are, the music changes. Terrytown, a town that During a side quest, the player builds up, and each stage of the building process, the music begins to bring in a new instrument until the town is completed and all the races of the land come together to create a beautiful tune that contains instruments and elements of all the different cultures. Another track, a personal favorite of mine, is Hyrule Castle. Being the final location where the player confronts Ganon and saves Zelda, there's a sense of finality while Link slowly climbs up higher and higher through the castle, as the music swells with a full orchestra playing a more desperate-sounding rendition of the original Legend of Zelda theme. However, this is just how the music plays on the outside of the castle. The music changes its instrumentation when Link is inside the castle. Instead of the grand orchestra with a very dramatic playing of loud brass strings and a haunting piano, most of the orchestra takes a back seat. Take a listen. The main instrument that can be heard is an organ that plays the same theme, but during a certain part of the song, Zelda's theme is played, representing what has been lost, and all that remains now is just a memory of what life was like before. Now, the final point I want to talk about is the significance of specific leitmotifs which play a very significant role in Breath of the Wild's design. But first, what is a leitmotif? Well, a leitmotif is a recurrent musical theme or composition that is associated with a particular person, idea, or situation. Ganon's theme, which can be described as powerful and tense, is constantly rising. These feelings that the music tries to convey represent the character's power and malice. This leitmotif plays in multiple different tracks, most particularly Calamity Ganon, and Dark Beast Ganon. The theme has this feeling of impending doom that continues to rise until finally reaching its climax. Then, there's Zelda's lullaby, which is the opposite. It appears in numerous different tracks as a sort of reminder of what the end goal is. The theme itself is very gentle and almost melancholic. The leitmotif is quite simple in its composition, which is good because it can be very memorable and easy to add slight alterations to benefit the atmosphere. For example, in The Master Sword, the theme can be heard clearly by the lead violin, which plays slowly to convey the emotion of the scene as Zelda's lullaby changes into something new. Another use of Zelda's lullaby can be heard after Ganon is defeated and the player finally completes their end goal. The track Do You Remember starts out with a music box-like instrument to keep the lullaby-like quality of the song before the full orchestra comes in with a sweeping and triumphant rendition of Zelda's lullaby that then ends with a flute playing a small part of the Breath of the Wild main theme. Main themes in any source of media tend to be played frequently so that the listener can associate the specific composition with a feeling, typically a feeling that plays an integral part to the story. The Star Wars films contain one of, if not the most famous main theme of all time. Composer John Williams designed the opening title crawl main theme to convey so much emotion with its grand and bombastic orchestration. I think we can all agree that the feeling John Williams is trying to get the audience to feel at this moment is the thrill of adventure. The main theme for The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild takes a slightly different approach. Here's a clip from a live concert in 2018. Notice how it opens with a single piano as it speeds up in tempo until it slows down to portray the quiet beauty of nature. The quietness of nature continues as more and more instruments come in, filling the space until suddenly the music cuts to a full orchestra loudly calling the listener to adventure and the glorious beauty of nature. The song eventually reaches its climax, only to suddenly cut back to the piano that ends on a single chord. Art is always changing, evolving, and we are now at a time where art can more directly involve the audience. Breath of the Wild is one of those pieces of art where you can feel the passion and the care the designers put into it. The level of detail, along with specific creative decisions, make it a masterclass in design, and I believe it perfectly encapsulates the beauty of the wild.